Welcome to the GovReport, a conversation about government, politics, and technology. I'm Christina Gagnier, and today I'm joined by Rick Klau, the Chief Technology Innovation Officer with the state of California. Great to have you, Rick. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Christina.
So the driver for today's conversation is your amazing work on the digital vaccine card that is now being used by other states. In this pandemic, it's a great success story, but it's also an interesting tale about open source and rapid deployment. I know that California just announced its open source policy a few years ago, so kind of recent. But this is sort of the first high profile example of that open source collaboration and implementation out in the marketplace. So can you tell us a little bit about the digital vaccine card and how it's going so far?
I would love to, Christina. Thank you. So not quite a year ago, a number of us at CDT were, as you might imagine, working essentially full-time on COVID-related issues. In particular, a number of folks on my team were active with the Department of Public Health on a number of initiatives throughout the vaccination campaign. As a result of that, we started seeing more people get vaccinated. I got my first dose in April. Realized that the paper card was maybe not the best thing that would allow us to carry with us proof of those vaccinations if that proof was ever needed. So we proposed to the Department of Public Health, to the governor's office, that this was a thing that we might want to embrace. With their endorsement and partnership, we did. And so the team at CDT built in a matter of about 6 weeks an implementation of what's known as the Smart Health Cards framework. We can talk more about that in a minute, but itself is an open source framework. And we released our digital vaccine record in June of 2021. Since then, we've delivered 13.5 million digital vaccine records to California residents. About 7.5 million people in total have downloaded records over the course of the last 7 or 8 months. And as you mentioned, we later released all of the code that we wrote for the front end and the middle tier to the public domain, hoping that other states might be able to take what we released and then deploy it for their own residents. And as you mentioned, a number have already done so, and we expect to see several more in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, I think this is a great open source success story. I think that there's that old adage, as California goes, so goes the nation. And by providing this open source code, that really did help to propel this across the country and, really solve a pain point in getting out vaccinations and proof of vaccinations. So what's the thinking behind the open source approach? This is a relatively new approach in government. So what was the thinking about going open source? Was that always something that you thought you were going to do, or midstream through the project thought that was the right approach? Just want to get some insight.
It was a wonderfully organic process. I would love to tell you that we had thought it all through from day one. It actually was not the case. So we happened to be among the first states that launched support for smart health cards. Louisiana released, I think, actually a few hours before we did in that second week in June. But by virtue of the fact that we're the largest state and we had vaccinated the most people in the country at that point, certainly it was a momentous occasion and endorsement of this open source framework, the Smart Health Cards framework. It was a few weeks after we launched that a friend of mine at the Colorado Digital Service reached out and asked whether we'd be willing to share our code, since he had been part of conversations with other states who didn't think they had the internal resources to deploy a system that they would build themselves, and or they didn't necessarily have budget that they could hire someone outside to build their own bespoke system. So, as you mentioned, the state had already embraced this open source strategy, intending to release code where possible. Several groups at CDT had previously released some code to the public domain. ODI has as well, the Office of Digital Innovation. A number of other departments and agencies have done so over the years. In this particular case, we released it to the public domain. We announced that we had done so. told everybody you can take the code, you can fork it, you can do whatever you want. It's there on GitHub if you want it. To our delight, we quickly heard from a couple of states that were actively exploring how they might do what we did in California. And the initial fear was they would have to start from scratch, they would have to write all the code, or they would have to hire a vendor and pay them to do the same. So I'm thrilled that within a couple of months of us releasing our code to the public domain, the state of Washington was able to release their digital vaccine record system. Interestingly enough, most recently, Washington, D.C. became the third implementation of our code. And I know of at least 4 other states that are in active stages of deploying their systems. It's not my story to tell who they are. When they announce, I will happily share that news. But it's phenomenal to see this embrace of civic tech, gov tech leaders recognizing that this is a perfect example of the network effect, that the more people on the same standard, the more value there is in the embrace of that standard. So shortly after we launched our digital vaccine record, both Apple and Google shipped support for smart health cards, so that now anyone that gets a digital vaccine record can store it natively on Apple Wallet or Google Pay, making it that much easier to retrieve and share if you're traveling and need to show proof of vaccination, or entering a location like a restaurant or a venue that needs you to be vaccinated in order to enter.
Well, this is definitely a great story and a testament to the ethos of open source, to see state governments sharing with other state governments, but also the private sector jumping in and making sure that there's ease of use, for the day-to-day user. This truly is an amazing story about a public-facing app. But I have to ask, what's next?
Well, actually, building on the success of the digital vaccine record, as you may know, smart health cards are not only used in the United States, they have been embraced nationally in Canada and Japan. A number of countries in Africa have now adopted smart health cards, but it is not the only credential in the market. In Europe, they have the EU Green Pass. There is ICAO is another standard. There are 4 current sort of major COVID credentials worldwide. The WHO, the World Health Organization, just last week announced that they're convening a working group to establish true interoperability across those standards, so that someone holding a smart health card in the US, today there are, I believe, 15 states, the majority of pharmacies and health systems all issue smart health cards. So the vast majority of Americans today can get a smart health card of their vaccination record. When traveling to Europe, would be able to use that smart health card and have it be correctly interpreted and understood, so that it could pass as proof of vaccination if that proof were required, which today for most countries, they are requiring proof of vaccination for entry. So I think in terms of what's next, I will be serving on that working group along with some folks from New York, part of the Vaccine Credential Initiative, of which we are a member. And the interest there is building on standards and open technology to solve a real problem, which in the middle of a pandemic, as much as I would like it to be in the past tense, I don't think we're there yet. This will increase its utility and value. And the more states that join and issue these credentials, the more valuable those credentials will be, and the more useful and adopted they will be worldwide.
This is a great example of something that is going to be interoperable and also extremely user-friendly, which today, with the pickiness of consumers and technology, is great. How do you think this will influence, the state of California's focus on other forms of identification?
Well, it's important to note that the digital vaccine record, and really the smart health cards framework, is explicitly not an identity document. So there's been much talk in the press about vaccine passports. This is not a passport. There is nothing about this that is establishing or conveying identity-related information. It is simply a health record that is delivered to the individual that allows them to then store it. If they want to share it, they can choose to share it. With regards to identity, a different group within CDT is actively building out a digital ID proof of concept that may end up using some similar concepts of verified credentials, which is a W3C standard, and of open technology. We're looking at working with login.gov, which is a service of the federal government at GSA. So implementing open technology, we will certainly share any code that we develop so that other states might be able to benefit from that work. But in terms of the digital vaccine record, it was actually very important that that not be commingled with identity because of the importance of identity being understood as protected information that has a different set of controls and use cases.
Yeah, it's great to hear that balance between openness and transparency and ease of use, and then also consumer privacy, which are things that are constantly in tension. It's great to see that you were able to balance that effectively. Our audience is largely people in government, people that are passionate about government technology. You know, what's a lesson here for our audience? Like, what's a key takeaway?
I mean, I think the first and foremost lesson is, I think it was Rahm Emanuel who's credited with the never waste a crisis. We were in the midst of a crisis, if you think back to the first half of last year, and it was exhilarating to see the speed with which our teams could execute, that we could understand the nature of the challenge before us, and candidly, the risk before us of embracing a technology that up to that point, it wasn't like it was in use in hundreds of millions of places. This was a framework that was largely designed to try and solve a problem that the COVID-19 pandemic created. But within all of that, we were able to execute quickly. We were able to do so in the open so that if there were risks or challenges or implementations that needed to be fixed, we could find them. And then by embracing an open standard and releasing our code to the public domain, it meant that we could benefit too. It wasn't that this was all altruistic. The state of Washington went and translated the digital vaccine record into 42 languages, which was 35 more than we had translated. And they then contributed all that code back to the GitHub repository so that anyone else that wants to deploy a system can take Washington's fork of California's code and get a whole bunch of translations for free, also which we could adopt. So I think leaning into that opportunity and not being spooked by it, but actually recognizing that time constraint created an opportunity for us to execute much more quickly than we might have otherwise.
Well, this is certainly a great story of collaboration, of diving into, open source and new types of technologies the government isn't used to. Rick, thank you so much for joining me today in this conversation.
Christina, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And once again, I'm Christina Gagnier with the GovReport. Thank you to our audience for tuning in.